The transfer orders had landed me at Fort Ravenwood, a sprawling military base tucked deep into the Pacific Northwest. Known more for its relentless rain and towering pines than any strategic importance, the base seemed like a monotonous assignment until I discovered the bunker. I had been assigned to the base's facilities management team. It wasn't glamorous work, but it beat long deployments in hostile territories. My duties involved inspecting and cataloging the base's older infrastructure, much of which had been built during World War II and largely forgotten in the decades since. The work was solitary, and most days I enjoyed the quiet. One drizzling morning, my supervisor handed me a faded map of the base. He circled a spot near the far southern edge, saying the area contained an old munitions storage facility. It hadn't been officially documented in years, and someone had flagged it for review. He'd waved it off as make work, a task to keep me busy. Probably just an overgrown shed, he had said. I set out with minimal equipment, a flashlight, a radio, and a notebook. The path to the southern edge was overgrown, the dirt road nearly swallowed by underbrush. After driving as far as my Jeep could take me, I walked the last mile through dense forest, the trees closing in like sentinels. The rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy with the scent of damp earth. The munitions storage facility turned out to be a bunker, its entrance hidden beneath a thick carpet of moss and vines. The heavy steel door stood slightly ajar, a jagged crack just wide enough to slip through. I hesitated, shining my flashlight into the darkness beyond. The air wafting out was stale, carrying a faint metallic tang. I radioed back to base, reporting my location and the state of the bunker. The response crackled back, "Proceed with caution. Let us know if you need assistance." Inside, the bunker was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. My flashlight's beam revealed a long corridor, the walls lined with rusting pipes and faded stencils indicating ammunition storage. The floor was littered with debris, old crates, rotting canvas sacks, and shards of broken glass. I made careful notes as I explored, cataloging the contents and condition. Deeper into the bunker, the air grew colder and the silence more oppressive. The place felt like it had been sealed off mid-operation, abandoned in a hurry. I found a few oddities: a clipboard left on a table, its paper yellowed but still legible, a chair tipped over in a corner, a rusted radio set with its cables cut. One room near the back caught my attention. Its door was heavier than the others, reinforced with thick steel and painted bright red. Stenciled across it were the words, "Authorized personnel only." The lock had long since rusted away, leaving the door slightly ajar. Inside, the room was a stark contrast to the rest of the bunker. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, and a large table dominated the center, covered with documents and maps. I sifted through the papers, most of which were mundane: inventory lists, personnel rosters, and supply orders. But one file caught my eye. It was marked with a red stamp, classified. Curiosity got the better of me. The file contained detailed reports about an incident on the base from 1952. The reports described strange occurrences, unexplained equipment failures, personnel experiencing severe anxiety, and a series of accidents in the southern sector. The incidents had been attributed to operational stress and inadequate safety protocols. The final entry recommended the decommissioning of the facility. As I read, the distant echo of metal striking metal broke the silence. My pulse quickened. I turned off my flashlight and strained to listen. The sound came again, faint but deliberate. It wasn't the random settling of an old structure. It was rhythmic, methodical. Someone else was in the bunker. I crept back toward the corridor, my flashlight off, relying on memory to navigate. The sound grew louder as I approached the main hall. My mind raced with possibilities: a fellow soldier checking the site, a trespasser, or something less explainable. At the end of the hall, I glimpsed a faint light. It was coming from the entrance, where the steel door had been pushed open wider. I pressed myself against the wall, my heart pounding as the light moved away, swallowed by the forest outside. Whoever it was had left. I radioed back to base, reporting the intruder. The response was swift: "Stay put. We're sending a team." The wait felt interminable. I stayed near the entrance, flashlight off, ears straining for any sound. When the team arrived, their flashlights cutting through the gloom, I felt a wave of relief. The rest of the day was a blur of debriefings and reports. The team swept the bunker, finding no sign of the intruder. They did, however, uncover more documents in the Red Room, some of which were quickly confiscated by higher-ups. I was ordered to keep the discovery quiet, under penalty of disciplinary action. In the weeks that followed, rumors swirled around the base. Some said the bunker had been part of secret experiments during the Cold War. Others claimed it was simply an abandoned storage site with no real significance. I never got answers. The memory of that day still lingers. I often think about the rhythmic sound in the darkness, the light moving through the trees, and the classified file that vanished into military bureaucracy. Fort Ravenwood may have seemed mundane on the surface, but beneath its rain-soaked pines, it held secrets best left undisturbed. My deployment to Camp Blackstone was supposed to be routine. Nestled in the middle of the desert, the base served as a training ground for new recruits and housed a skeleton crew of officers. By the time I arrived, most of the base's operations had shifted to more modern facilities, leaving only a few aging structures in use. Among them was Barracks 13, an unassuming building that would become the centerpiece of my most unnerving experience in the military. I had been assigned to logistics, which meant long days organizing supply shipments and maintaining inventory records. The work wasn't glamorous, but it kept me busy. My quarters were in Barracks 13, a two-story building on the edge of the base. It had been built decades earlier, and its age showed in the creaking floors, chipped paint, and occasional flickering light. Still, it was serviceable, and I thought little of its condition. From the moment I moved in, I noticed the peculiar silence that enveloped the building. Even when it was full of people, other soldiers coming and going, radios playing in the common area, the barracks seemed to absorb sound. Voices felt muted, footsteps barely echoed, and at night, the quiet became so intense it was almost oppressive. One evening, after a particularly long day, I decided to turn in early. The barracks were unusually empty. Most of the others were attending a training exercise on the far side of the base. I welcomed the solitude and climbed into my bunk, hoping for a full night's sleep. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of faint tapping. It was irregular, like someone lightly rapping on a door with their knuckles. My room was on the second floor, near the end of the hall, and the sound seemed to be coming from somewhere nearby. I sat up, straining to listen. The tapping continued for a few moments before stopping abruptly. I told myself it was nothing, perhaps a branch scraping against a window or the old pipes acting up. But as I lay back down, the tapping resumed, louder this time. It seemed to move, starting near my door and shifting further down the hall. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the corridor. The beam illuminated the worn linoleum floor and faded green walls, but there was no sign of anyone. The tapping started again, this time from the first floor. It was faint, but distinct enough to draw me downstairs. I followed the sound to the common area, where the overhead lights cast a dim yellow glow. The room was empty, the couches and tables undisturbed. Yet, the tapping persisted, coming from the far corner where a door led to the utility closet. Cautiously, I approached the door and opened it. The closet was small, crammed with cleaning supplies and a few maintenance tools. The tapping had stopped, replaced by an unnerving silence. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what I was expecting to find, before closing the door and heading back upstairs. The next morning, I mentioned the incident to a fellow soldier, Martinez, who had been at the base longer than me. He shrugged it off, saying the barracks had always been weird. He told me about strange noises others had reported over the years. Footsteps when no one was there, doors opening and closing on their own, and items going missing only to reappear in odd places. Probably just the wind, he said, though his tone lacked conviction. Over the following weeks, the tapping became a regular occurrence. It never happened during the day, only at night, and always when the barracks were quiet. I started keeping a journal, documenting the times and locations of the sounds. Patterns began to emerge. The tapping often started near the utility closet, moved through the common area, and ended in the upstairs hallway. One night, I decided to confront the source directly. Armed with a flashlight and my journal, I waited in the common area until the tapping began. It started as usual, faint and distant, growing louder as it moved toward the utility closet. When the sound reached the door, I swung it open, flashlight cutting through the darkness. The closet was empty, just as it had been before. Frustrated, I stepped inside, inspecting the walls and floor for any explanation. That's when I noticed a section of the floor that sounded hollow when tapped. Kneeling down, I used a wrench from the shelf to pry up a loose floorboard, revealing a narrow crawlspace beneath. The crawlspace was filled with dust and debris, but among the clutter, I found a small metal box. Inside were old photographs, letters, and a few personal items, dog tags, a wristwatch, and a pocket knife. The photographs depicted soldiers in uniform, standing in front of what looked like a much younger version of Barracks 13. The letters were addressed to someone named Private Allen and dated back to the 1950s. They spoke of camaraderie, long nights on duty, and a growing sense of unease in the barracks. One letter, in particular, stood out. It was unsigned and hastily written, describing strange happenings and an overwhelming feeling of being watched. The writer begged Private Allen to leave the barracks, warning that no good will come of staying. I took the box to Martinez the next day, showing him what I'd found. He was as puzzled as I was, but suggested we turn it over to the base historian. The historian was intrigued and promised to look into the history of Barracks 13. A few days later, she called me to her office. She had found records of an incident in 1957 involving Private Allen. He had gone missing under mysterious circumstances, and despite an extensive search, no trace of him was ever found. The barracks had been briefly closed after his disappearance but reopened a few years later with no official explanation. The historian speculated that the items in the box had belonged to Allen, and that the tapping might be related to the events surrounding his disappearance. It was a logical theory, but it offered little comfort. The tapping stopped after that. Whether it was a coincidence or something else, I couldn't say. Barracks 13 remained as silent as ever, its walls holding secrets that may never be fully uncovered. Even now, years later, I sometimes dream of that tapping, echoing through the stillness of the desert night. My assignment to Naval Air Station Crosswind felt like a step up. Situated near the Gulf Coast, the base was primarily a training facility for aviators, boasting sprawling runways, rows of aircraft, and numerous hangars. It was a far cry from my previous post in a dreary, inland motor pool. I looked forward to the change in scenery, but I didn't anticipate the unease that would come with working near Hangar 9. Hangar 9 was unlike the other buildings on base. While most of the hangars were bustling with activity, housing planes, maintenance crews, and instructors, this one sat isolated at the far end of the airfield. Its paint was faded, and its towering doors were secured with heavy chains and padlocks. The official story was that the hangar had been decommissioned years ago, its structure deemed unsafe after hurricane damage. My first encounter with Hangar 9 was during a base tour. Our guide, a senior petty officer, pointed it out briefly, mentioning its disuse. He moved on quickly, but one of my fellow newcomers, Henson, asked why it hadn't been torn down. The guide shrugged and said something about budgeting and historical preservation. His answer felt rehearsed. A few weeks later, I was assigned to night watch duty. The base had a strict rotation, and everyone, regardless of rank, had to pull their share of overnight shifts. The job was simple: patrol the grounds, monitor security cameras, and log any unusual activity. My partner for the shift was Petty Officer Blake, a quiet guy who had been stationed at Crosswind for years. During our first patrol, we drove the perimeter in a standard-issue SUV. The airfield was quiet, the planes lined up like sleeping giants under the glow of floodlights. When we reached the far end of the field, I noticed Hangar 9 looming in the darkness. Its silhouette was stark against the night sky, and something about it made me shiver. "Anything ever happen over there?" I asked Blake, nodding toward the hangar. He hesitated before answering. Not really. It's just an old building. Nothing inside. His tone was dismissive, but the way he gripped the steering wheel told a different story. That night, as we monitored the security cameras in the watchtower, I couldn't shake the feeling that Blake wasn't telling me everything. The cameras showed various angles of the base, including a distant view of Hangar 9. It sat in shadow, its massive doors sealed tight. Still, I found my eyes drifting to the screen, half expecting something to move. Around 2 a.m., the motion detector near the hangar triggered an alert. A small red light blinked on the console, accompanied by a soft beep. Blake glanced at it and muttered, "Probably just a bird." I wasn't convinced. "Should we check it out?" Blake sighed but agreed. We drove out to the hangar, our headlights cutting through the darkness. The motion detector was mounted on a pole near the corner of the building. When we arrived, there was no sign of movement. Blake got out to inspect the detector while I stayed in the vehicle, scanning the area with a flashlight. "Nothing," Blake said after a few minutes. "Might have been a strong gust or something." As we turned to leave, I thought I heard a faint metallic clang from inside the hangar. I froze, shining my flashlight at the doors. Blake noticed my reaction and followed my gaze. "It's locked up tight," he said. "Nobody's in there." I wanted to believe him, but the sound had been too deliberate to ignore. We lingered for a moment longer before heading back to the watchtower. I spent the rest of the night replaying the noise in my mind, trying to rationalize it. The next day, I asked around about Hangar 9. Most people dismissed it as just another old structure, but a few mentioned rumors. One story claimed it had been used for experimental aircraft during the Cold War, while another suggested it was a storage site for classified equipment. The most unsettling rumor, however, was that several mechanics had gone missing while working there in the 1970s. The official reports labeled them AWOL, but some believed they had met a different fate. On my next night watch, I brought up the rumors to Blake. He laughed them off but seemed uneasy. "People love to make up stories," he said, not meeting my eyes. That night, the motion detector near Hangar 9 went off twice. Both times we found nothing unusual. But as we were leaving the second time, I spotted something strange. The padlock on the hangar doors looked newer than the chains it secured, as if it had been replaced recently. I pointed it out to Blake, but he brushed it off, saying the locks were probably inspected regularly. A week later, I was on watch duty alone. Blake had called in sick, leaving me to handle the patrols and cameras by myself. Around midnight, the motion detector near Hangar 9 triggered again. This time, I decided to investigate on foot. Armed with a flashlight and my radio, I approached the hangar cautiously. The air around the building felt colder than the rest of the base, and the silence was almost oppressive. As I circled the hangar, my flashlight caught something on the ground near the doors. A single screw, shiny and out of place among the weathered concrete. When I looked up, I realized one of the hinges on the massive doors was missing a screw, as if it had been recently tampered with. My radio crackled to life, startling me. It was the watchtower, asking if everything was okay. I reported what I'd found and requested backup. While I waited, I thought I heard movement inside the hangar. A faint shuffling sound, like footsteps on concrete. When the backup arrived, we searched the area thoroughly but found no signs of entry. The padlock was intact, and the chains were secure. Still, the missing screw and the noises I'd heard left me unsettled. The next morning, I filed a report about the incident. A few days later, I was called into the commanding officer's office. He listened to my account with a neutral expression before informing me that Hangar 9 was off-limits and that I was not to investigate further. His tone left no room for argument. I spent the remainder of my time at Crosswind avoiding Hangar 9 as much as possible. Even now, years later, I occasionally think about that cold, silent building and the unanswered questions it left behind. Whatever secrets Hangar 9 held, the Navy was determined to keep them buried.